Wholeness, welcome. This is Josh, Inner Skilled and Integrating Presence. And today I'm joined by Ivor. Ivor, what's happening?
Hey Josh, nice to see you again.
Likewise, Ivor and I, let's just, his pen name, right? Ivor Gently, which I think is a really beautiful pen name there. And Ivor and I met roughly over 2 years ago now at Amaravati, which is a Buddhist monastery outside of London in the Thai forest tradition of Ajahn Chah. And we had some quite lively conversations, I'll say that. We actually kind of butted heads on something. I don't know if we're going to go into that today or not. Probably not. But so I invited him to do this, and thanks for doing this because we were talking before the show. This takes a somewhat degree of courage. Some people won't even ever consider anything like this, but some people doing it the first time, it does take a little bit of courage, even though, maybe two or three people might see it, but who knows, thousands, you never know really, right? So why don't you tell people about, it's the standard question I'll stick with, who's Ivor? What kind of work does he do?
Yeah, it's a tricky question for me, right? It's you can answer it in many ways. In my typical answer, actually, when it comes to anything that I produce, it's almost like it doesn't matter who I am, right? It's about what you're saying. It's about what you're like. If you're writing a book, it's about what the book says rather than who you are. And to me, it's almost like it's a bit of a problem that all of us have in society when we focus too much on individuals and not enough on what they're saying or what they're doing or what they're even in politics, right? It's all about character rather than or perceived character rather than the actual thing that they're promoting. Uh, but okay, I'm gonna follow the format. So basically, I would say I spent the first 30 years of my life like kind of being a very mainstream kind of normie, having that kind of life. And then certain things clicked. Not to go into too much detail, but basically, I underwent a like what I would consider a very deep transformation, where everything basically changed. My perception of reality changed, and it was almost like I started my life from the beginning. It was really like another person from that point on. So that was about 20 years ago. And so the first 30 years of my life, I don't even want to talk about it because in a way it's like I kind of identify with that. In a way, I could almost say that was kind of a waste. Um, but you can also say that nothing is really a waste, and you needed all of that. And then for the last since that transition, it's really been about the spiritual realm, broadly speaking. And yeah, I tend to live quite a hermetic life. Try not that I try to interact with external reality or with the society as little as possible, but it just kind of comes naturally. Like I just prefer to stay as much out of it as I possibly can, and yeah, just kind of try to interact with reality on a very intuitive way, and I would say really focus more on the being than on the doing. Yeah.
Well, right on. Now, when you say hermetic life, you don't mean that's as kind of like a hermit would, not the esoteric hermeticism, right? You're probably familiar with hermeticism too, which is, yeah, they are. I mean, you can be a hermit into hermeticism, or you can be a hermeticist that's very public and outgoing, right? So you're talking about just being a hermit. I have actually studied a little bit of hermeticism, but that might be besides the point. So let's talk about. I think the question that's dying to be posed here is, if I can use that phrase, what brought about this change, this huge change? Because it's kind of similar in my life. I had this huge transformation happen in my life as well. So in a way, it's quite similar. Would you be comfortable with
Sure.
mentioning anything about that and what happened and what turned you down the path that you're down today, if that's the right way to put it?
Yeah, I would say I was, the environment where I grew up, which was basically in Central Europe, in a very normal, very mainstream family, kind of atheistic, materialistic, like there was nothing spiritual or esoteric or anything like that whatsoever. And very kind of, I was always rational, very rational into all these analytical or logical things. So very mind oriented, left brain oriented. So I was in an environment which is very different from where I am now, but it's almost like that environment didn't allow me to go into that direction, into the spiritual direction. But I would say it was always kind of brewing. There were like hints here and there. There were like glimpses. I remember I would watch a movie, something like, for example, the first time I watched Vanilla Sky, and I was like, wow, this is like, and it had all kinds of weird sensations that I never had before. It's like something hits you. It's like you get something what you can't really explain. You feel, wow, there's something here. Um, so there were those kinds of things happening, and then there was just an overwhelming feeling that the life that I'm living, which was kind of very mainstream, you could say fairly successful. I was an IT consultant, very comfortable in all ways, and most people thought, wow, he's doing really good. And for me, there was this really strong nagging feeling like, what am I doing? It's like I'm living on autopilot. And it wasn't something that I chose. It wasn't a result of anything I read or any people that I met. It was just a strong inner feeling, and then it just became stronger and stronger. And finally, I couldn't even stay in that job, so I just left everything and I went traveling. And then during that travel, basically the whole kind of structure of my life, you could say the ego structure, but not just in a psychological sense, also in the sense of my conception of reality and how it works, it just completely collapsed. So that at some points it felt I actually was kind of worried about my mental sanity. I thought I was going crazy, because some parts of that experience seemed at that time almost like paranoid schizophrenia. For example, I'll give you an example just to to illustrate what I mean. I saw that there was a very clear connection between my inner processes, like my thoughts, and what was actually happening externally, like in real time, right? Which my previous model of reality just didn't allow for that. And so when you see that, it's like, okay, is this Truman Show? Is like what's going on, right? So it's that kind of. It's because especially because I wasn't ready, right? Someone who's been in contact with those kinds of notions, might not feel that that's so strange. But for me, that was just so beyond anything that I thought was possible. That it just collapsed my whole worldview, right? Which until that point, like I said, was very materialistic, very kind of. I'm not too good with these philosophical concepts, but I don't know if there's a thing it's called randomistic, right? Like the random universe, the idea that maybe it's called determinism. I don't know what it's called, but the idea that things are happening randomly and there's a separation between my internal life and the external life, right? That was my previous understanding of how reality works, and there was absolutely no doubt that that's how it works. And then my actual experience was just like in my face, completely clear that that's just not how it is. right? Like I would literally have a thought, and then like 2 seconds later, that thing happened, and it wasn't just one thing; it just kept happening, right? So that's kind of was what triggered this. I mean, that was a part of it. There were also all kinds of physical, or you could say physio-psychological things happening, like all kinds of very intense sensations, and people would call it energies or openings, or it was like I think some people call it a spiritual emergency, which then goes into spiritual emergence, right? It felt like a breakdown. It felt like it could have been a breakdown. And I think if I was in a wrong situation, like I could have ended up in a mental institution. And I would say many people who are in mental institutions have probably gone under some kind of process like that, and would just kind of couldn't find the right angle.
Well, it's yeah. The I think I like this term spiritual emergency because, like you're illustrated so well. If there's no reference points before you've lived this way, that separation you're talking about, and then all of a sudden some very profound things start happening, and it happens so quickly. It's not as gradual as some people do in their practice, right? Some people are in practice to gradually wake up over a long time, and some people have sudden awakenings. I don't know if it's a true awakening, but something happened where it happened quickly. And some people call these things like Kundalini syndrome, where this force will rise so quick and one's not really prepared to deal with it, doesn't have any reference points, like hasn't read or had spiritual teachings that talk about like this mirroring effect you're talking about, like this, I guess you'd call it law of reciprocity, or as within as without. I mean, some people take these teachings too as metaphorical, or only maybe 3% or 5% of that, right? But sometimes they can be quite dramatic, and then um, the amount of synchronicity that can happen too. Certain things can be quite synchronous. I don't know the word here. A lot of synchronicity can happen in a short amount of time, and that can be very confusing and puzzling too. So how did you eventually deal with this? Did you tell anybody about it? Did you start studying? Did you yeah, how did you, when this stuff started happening, how did you go about it? What did you mention it to anyone? How did you know who to talk to and who not to talk to about it as well? Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. You transported me back into that point of time, which was a very special time in my life, right? Because it is really like the feeling of, wow, I was blind and now I can see. I mean, that was a part of it, and then the other part was like deep confusion and even kind of worry, like what's going on with me. And then, so this was in Thailand, actually, on the island of Koh Phangan, on like a pretty remote beach, which in and of itself was like, it was actually a perfect place for that kind of thing. And then there was a guy living in the bungalow next to me with a shaved head and like really sparkling eyes. And I never talked to him. I was just like, I noticed him, and he noticed me. And then one day I just decided I'm just going to go and talk to him. And I just told him for no special reason what's going on. And he looks at me and he says, "Have you met God?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" And basically, so up until that point, I wasn't really even familiar with anything about Buddhism or any other religion for that matter, even though like, nominally I was supposed to be Catholic, but I was never interested in any of that. So I knew nothing about Buddhism or anything, I wasn't interested at all. But then he gave me some books, and there was a Buddhist meditation retreat on the island, and there was like an actual 10-day retreat in just starting in a few days. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to try that. And that guy really seemed to kind of know something that I didn't know. So that's how I started meditating. And I think that really kind of stabilized me, because then you see actually all of these things that you've been kind of intuitively, downloading. Well, I mean, they're all in the Buddha was talking about that, right? So that kind of made me realize, okay, I'm probably not going crazy. This is just really some kind of an intuitive opening that I'm going through. And then over time, things just stabilized. Yeah. So after this happened, I really started meditating a lot. Like, and my format was doing meditation retreats, usually 10 days. And I would just do them sometimes back to back, or I think in the first 2 years I probably did like 15 of them, or at least 10, maybe 15. And that became, the basically what my life was about. And I would say to some extent it never changed, at some point. So that was 20 years ago. So at some points, I did kind of get lost again in the world of Babylon, but I never really lost that connection. And I would say over time it only kind of things became clearer and just calmer and just normal, right?
Well, right on. So we can just say this, right? Goenka. This was a Goenka retreat that was going on this
No,
island.
this was
No, it was something
it was
else.
something else. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. I was going to say, because usually a Goenka practitioner wouldn't mention God, one of the first things. I would think that would be highly unlikely.
Right.
Or maybe not. I don't know. But you have done that tradition too. So you're, I would say, a fairly hardcore meditator, or was at one time. I mean, you have a deep sitting practice from what I remember talking to you, So I guess that's what I'm most interested in. So I guess tell me about your practice, from when you first started to if you have a daily sitting practice, the different retreats you've gone on. I guess if you've had any teachers, just basically anything you want to say about it, and then what have you been practicing lately, and then if I guess maybe any quote unquote successes or breakthroughs or maybe aim of practice. So just basically anything you want to say about it, I think.
Okay, so the retreat on Koh Phangan was run by a Western couple. So it was within a Buddhist monastery on the island, but they themselves were not a monk and a nun because they were married. But they were organizing the retreat, so it was definitely not typical. And it was very much focused. So it was a 10-day retreat, which they called Vipassana retreat. But there was a lot of what they call loving kindness meditation, I guess what people would call a metta practice. And I would say I was blessed by being introduced to the world of spirituality and Buddhism through that kind of quite unconventional, like non-sectarian way, right? Because they weren't into building their own group and building a kind of a cult. There was nothing sectarian about it. They were just holding retreats. I mean, okay, they did have some assistants and they did have their own group, but it wasn't about kind of increasing their little thing, their little fringe Buddhist sect. And they encouraged people to go to other retreats, which I did, right? So I went to a few different retreats. So I went to a place called, all in Thailand, there's a place called Swan Mok that is based on the teachings of Ajahn Buddhadasa. And then there's another place in the north, which is also kind of associated with Buddhadasa, but slightly different. That was in Doi Sutep. I think now they do it in another place, but I forgot the name. And then I went into Cuenca. So I saw that each of those places were kind of doing their own thing, right? Both both theoretically, they were kind of focusing on different things, and also practically. Like for example, some people, some of them would do a lot of walking meditation, kind of half walking, half sitting. Some of them would do no walking meditation at all. Some of them would do a lot of concentration, like samatha practices. Some of them would really say that the samatha is just preparation for reflection, right? The wise reflection, which they included metta practices in that. And some people say, there is a popular opinion that if you do too many different things, you're never really gonna dig a hole deep enough. And I see that point. But from my perspective, I think it was really beneficial to see all these different ways of looking at it, because I think that really, and that just works with my personality, because I do like to have a free mind, really allow myself to explore everything and not fall into any bubbles.
Well, how do you know what to go deep on if you've only had just a sampling of a couple things, you know? If you happen to get it right off the bat, then you're really fortunate. But if you get into something that you commit to for a long time, that's, going to take you far where you need to be, then yeah, it helps, especially starting off to familiarize yourself or oneself with a huge territory and then, yeah, then choose from there, I feel, So I'm on the same page as you.
Hmm. Yeah, and I saw, in some of these, let's call it traditions or branches, they're very specific about this is the only way to do it, and all the other ways are pretty much wrong or are not going to lead to a good result. And so, I had the benefit of seeing other things beforehand, so that I knew this was not really, this doesn't work for me, right? But let's say if you start in that kind of in a tradition that has this kind of view, this is the only way, this is the only right way. It may be likely that you're kind of you're going to be limited in your understanding.
Yeah, this is what I tell people. I mean, that's a huge claim because I've met a few that I guess traditions, lines of approach that make that huge claim, and it gets the attention, obviously. And so the way I look at that is, if they're right, if they just to say they happen to be right, well then I'm going to miss out big time. However, if they're wrong and then I buy into that, and then it's almost like, okay, well, I just there that's not completely true. So it's really hard to know, So I don't want to be totally dismissive, but it's a high bar, right? That's a huge claim. If you're going to make that claim, you better be, super serious about keeping it, because I don't know of any other claim that could be as strong as that. So yeah, my heart doesn't leap up at people that make that claim. However, if I were to have some kind of defense to it, if it really is, then it could give people a really good motivation to stay with it. However, it's not a way to bring in beginners, you know what I mean? And yeah, we can all see the downsides of that, I think. But I just don't want to write it off wholesale, because if for somehow happens to be, well, then I'm the one and everybody else is missing out for not doing it. So this is why what this whole thing is pointing to is discernment, So is my wisdom and discernment sharp enough to know with a absolute certainty, the same degree of certainty that they're claiming? And I would say, no, my wisdom and discernment is not on that level where I could be 100% sure one way or another. You know what I mean? So that makes it even more challenging for me. But I would just for me, I would just recognize, okay, my level of discernment and wisdom is not enough to make that call. And if it's not a cult, I will go check them out and just incorporate what's useful from that. And until I can make that call, then I don't need to make that call. You know what I mean? I will just, okay, that's that. And so, yeah, find my place in whatever, So, yeah, these are all really good points. So I guess now, what is your do you so you talk more about intuitive? So for years of my practice, what I was doing is, when I was sitting down every day to practice, I would just say, either right before I sat down or when I sat down, okay, this is what I need to focus on in my meditation, and then that would be the meditation. And there was a lot of upsides to that, but for the past few years I have just been doing a strict samatha practice, because I haven't stuck been that committed with one thing in my practice. So I thought I would give it a go, doing a dedicated thing, anapanasati, traditional Visuddhimagga, and just give it a go for a while. So tell me about your practice today then, and how you approach practice. And then if you want to incorporate that into the intuition we were talking about before too.
Yeah, so just to add something to the previous conversation about what's the right path. Well, I would say there's a few fundamental questions, right? One is the kind of the nature of knowing. How do we know anything, right? There's the discernment. There's the analytical, logical knowing, and I would say there's intuition, which is quite separate for me. It's really feeling based. It's difficult to put your finger on it, right? It's like gut knowing. And so that's really where I trust that more than I trust anything that my mind says or that any other person says, right? And I'm kind of like, I mean, I obviously tried both approaches, but overall, I'm happier with the results that I get when I follow my gut, and my intuition. Okay, what feels right? And to me, it just doesn't feel right when someone else is telling me how to meditate. Like, it's just not really acceptable. Because I feel the whole point of meditation for me is to really not do anything, to let it be done by itself. If I don't know, maybe that's not the best way to phrase it, but to not even direct my attention, but to completely let go, right? And let that other force, whatever you want to call it, the not me, kind of take over. And I would say all the big insights that I had uh, were never a result of me thinking about stuff. It was always what felt like a spontaneous download, right? Just like a spark. And so that's really what I trust. And I feel even defining, like if you say this is the right path, okay, the right path to where? I mean, do we even agree on where are we actually going, right? Because then the same people who tell you this is the right path, then they will also define the goal, right? Which they will usually say, well, it's enlightenment or something like that. And I would even question that premise. What does that even mean? Like, what does that look like? Right? There's a lot of assumptions here which are not actually intuitive. You need to mentally and intellectually accept a certain concept that you don't actually know is true in order to even follow that kind of an approach. And so to me, what feels much better is just to really be down to earth as much as possible and just take it day by day and see the improvements in my life. Like, that's really, for me, that's the goal. I see there's an aspect of my life that doesn't work well, and that's what I want to change. And for me, that's good enough. And that is the goal as far as I'm concerned. I don't even want to think about enlightenment. I mean, that's just another concept. Not to put it down. I'm not saying it's made up, but it's just too far from my actual experience. And I think it could be a trap. It could be just a trap of the mind, where the mind uses, in a way, it's almost like another form of separation, right? Because that concept separates you from the here and now. And for me, it's like this. This is the point, right? And then this then translates to the kind of practice that I want to be doing. I want to be doing the kind of practice that helps me have a better life, right? Tomorrow and next week, right? And again, it's a question of definition. What does that even mean, a better life? Well, I would say it means more peace of mind. It means more clarity. Like very practical things, even like material things, right? It means more abundance. It means just better physical health, emotional health, like simple things, right? It doesn't have to be super grandiose, right? And I think many people maybe, their view of enlightenment is that it's something very special and like, super extraordinary, when in fact, maybe that's not what it is or what it needs to be at all. Maybe it is more about something that's actually very natural to us. This is why I really always like the teachings of Ajahn Sumedho, because that's how I understand him, right? Like some of the things he says is basically enlightenment is now, and I don't want to misquote him, but to me, I'm kind of closer to the approach that is less directed at something very special. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. There's so much you put in there. Yes, first off, I want to agree with you that it needs to be beneficial, right? So what you're talking about, in my experience, have actually just been the side effects of meditation. Another approach. I'll probably just make a little bullet points here. Is this all for me? Am I doing this for my own ends, or am I doing this for my own welfare and happiness? But that will also be for the welfare and happiness of others. And then the big thing though is long term. So if we go into this notion of past lives, future lives, and no discernible beginning, no discernible end, and it's if that's the case, and it's even crazier how we've forgotten all this. So for me, my personal thing, yeah, it's great to improve my life, and it has improved my life, but at the end of the day, if that is the case where it's just lifetime after lifetime, then how does that help me in the really long term? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like it's going to have that. The other thing that came up when you're talking there is faith. So this is a huge thing on the path that I really don't have. I'm working on faith right now too, because there's just certain things that are beyond me. And this is where I can look at people on the path, and I look at that, not to put them on a pedestal or something, but you can kind of see how they are. They exemplify things. They're like a living embodiment of what's possible. I mean, I guess we don't have as many of these role models and practitioners, but there are very wise people, very loving people in the world that I'm nowhere near. Not that we need to copy them or anything, but these are people that we can consult and bounce off to get their feedback. Because, yes, I totally agree with the intuition and knowing. However, I would say that until I have a certain degree of clarity and I think purity, then what my intuition will say will not always be the best thing. I'm not saying the analytical mind will either. You know what I mean? So, yes, why I know that even some of these sutta or truth has to be known like in the body ultimately. But if there's anything, um, how does that work? My wisdom isn't there to know how that works. You know what I mean? Um, Also, if we go into like metaphysical things and I just open myself up to whatever there is, then some things in the unseen world that I don't know how operate, how do I know for sure that some kind of forces or causes and conditions are acting through me, or either for my benefit or not for my benefit? So that's a whole nother realm that I'm not qualified to know about, but I know some people that are, and I can see kind of the access to information that they have, and in their practice and what they're capable of, that they can tap into things that I'm not capable of now. So just because I can't see it and know it in my experience doesn't mean that it's not there and something to pay attention to. Um, so those are a few things. There was a few other things that were in there, what you said, but those are things that I want to raise. Like, I guess the biggest thing is, where is faith on your path? And have you identified certain people or things in your life that you want to aspire to? Oh, I think the other thing to mention is this notion of yeah, it is kind of almost heady and abstract in a way. I think there's a clearly defined thing in Theravada, though, stream entry. This is something that's more relatable to people, and it's more clearly defined and capable, and I think it's doable. One of the things of Dhamma is it's visible here and now. You don't have to wait. You can verify. And it has to be verified, like you're saying. The most important thing you're saying, I feel, is that this all needs to be seen and known for oneself. We can't go to an outside source. to get ultimate authority and have it handed down. This needs to be seen and known for each wise one for themselves. And like you mentioned the Kalama Sutta to me too, it needs to be for the long-term welfare and happiness of myself and others, but how long-term are we going to go? And he also says you have to see and know it for yourself in that sutta too, you know. So all these things are, and then with the analytical mind, one thing I might also put to you is, how do you see merging these things, or do you see it's helpful instead of splitting off analytical mind or our tendency, left brain tendencies, and then with the spiritual? Is there a way to bring these together? Do you see, or do they need to be kept separate, and one kind of vilified and the other, raised up and pursued? Or how do you see that kind of dichotomy?
There's
So
so
lots of
there's so
stuff
much
there, I
there. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
know. That all came from what you were talking to as well. So yeah, any of that's cool to address.
Okay, so let's start with faith. I think real faith is actually knowing, right? When you have true faith, you know something, right? And I know this is contrary, maybe even to definition of faith in the dictionary. But if you believe something, if you choose to believe something, and then that's your faith, I think you're lost.
I would totally agree. These are two separate things. Belief is the enemy of knowledge, right? We don't need to believe or disbelieve, but faith is not belief or disbelief. To me, faith means, okay, I see something. I know that I'm not there. This looks like it's beneficial. How do I get there? I can't bridge that gap now, but it's possible, right? And the Buddha said, I wouldn't teach this if it wasn't possible. So I have to have faith because I'm nowhere near that level. It doesn't
Okay.
mean I have to believe what he says.
Yeah.
Every single thing that he shares has to be tested and seen and known directly for oneself, not believed in because he said it, right? It has to be verified in one's own experience. So to me, that's faith, because if you believe it or disbelieve it, that's completely beside the point. I don't go around telling people I believe in bicycles, right? No, because I've seen a bicycle, I've got on one, I've ridden it, I know it directly. I don't have to believe it or disbelieve it anymore.
Well, and that's what gives you
So
faith, I would say, right? Like I have,
exactly.
I have what I would call faith in some principles of how the universe works, which happens to align with what some other people have said. But the reason I have faith is not because they said it. The reason I have faith is because I've experienced it so many times and so clearly that I would just say, well, I know that that's how it is. So for me, that's really faith. So,
That's called verified faith, just so you know the
okay,
correct terminology, or not, right? That's verified faith. And that's right. That's something that it should be verified. It should be verified with wisdom. It's not blindly
exactly, yeah.
taken. No blind faith. That's not encouraged at all.
Right. So on some level, I would say there's as far as I can see, there's no real distinction between wisdom and faith. Maybe, maybe faith. Maybe I guess when people look at me and in the way that I live, people that surround me that live quite differently from my lifestyle, they usually describe me as having a lot of faith or even religious, which I wouldn't describe myself like that. To them, it looks like I got faith, but I think they don't. It's just they don't see reality like I see it. So they think I'm operating from faith when actually I'm operating from what I truly, I would say, know to be true, right? Or
Yeah, these faculties balance each other, right? Because, yeah, faith is verified with wisdom. And if I don't have the wisdom, then I have the faith until I can get to the wisdom.
okay,
They kind of balance each other there, the faculties. Yeah. But no, yeah, I totally see, yeah, what you're saying. Totally, yeah.
yeah, I would say I'm probably very much focused on the wisdom element here, you know. And then, well, faith, yeah, again, I would say faith to the extent that it's not based on wisdom is probably, at least I'm talking for myself, based on some kind of intuitive knowing, like intuitively, I feel I should go there. So maybe that's faith. I don't know. But again, it's not really an intellectual thing. I think faith that's based on rationale and analytical deduction, to me, that's just not really where I want to be. Based on what I've tried in my life, I've tried that approach, and I, it just didn't really work very well. And I see this is usually where people get lost. They get lost in one of those bubbles because that's what I believe, right? And oftentimes there is a group dynamic, right? There's a sect, there's a group, and well, my group believes that, so I got faith. And I don't know, it's just not my way.
Totally agree. Not everything can be comprehended with rationality and logic. There's way more subtle, profound things where it's not the right tool.
Yeah.
It's you don't cut a cake with a chainsaw. So yeah, I mean, or it'll be really messy and not helpful. Yeah, totally agree there
And
too.
then you brought another a few very interesting points when you were talking about long term versus short term. And then also, is it only good for me or is it good for the whole? I think these are very interesting perspectives. Like, for example, long term versus short term really, I think, really changes the way that you make your decisions, right? Because if you're playing the long game, and by long game, I mean a game that's longer than just one lifespan, basically infinite number of lifespans, you're really not going to be so concerned with short-term gain, right? And you're going to be, for example, willing to even give your physical life for a principle, right? That's going to be a deal you're going to be willing to take because you're going to value your, what people call your soul or your karma, or something long-term, right? Something that is there, that transcends one lifespan. You're going to value that more than some immediate gain. And I think that is really important. For me, that's been a very important distinction in my life. And I'm really training myself to think in this long-term way, right? What's good for me, even if it's really going to be unpleasant immediately, what's the right thing to do rather than what's the more pleasant, convenient way to do in the short term. Because I believe there is a certain kind of dichotomy between short-term gain, or I would even call it short-term pleasure or satisfaction, and then long-term pleasure and satisfaction. And it's almost like you gotta choose one or the other. That seems to be the way that reality works metaphysically, right? Usually if you do the right thing, there's going to be a short-term pain associated with that, even if it's just something as simple as addiction, right? If you're addicted to something, it can be very difficult, right, not to pursue that addiction in the short term. But then, of course, in the long term, that's going to lead to a higher level of pleasure, to be free of addiction. Or to tell the truth, oftentimes it's not very pleasant short term, right? To really follow what you believe, even in the spiritual world, right? To go to a meditation teacher and tell him, look, I think what you're teaching is a little bit limited, and I don't really want to do it like that. It can be quite unpleasant. He's going to kick you out of the retreat, right? But if you really do what you feel is right, and I was in that kind of a situation, and sometimes I didn't do the right thing, and I was like, you know what, I want to stay here for 10 days, and uh, but I think that's really important, and I would say, the skillful approach is always, I would say, the long-term approach, right? Like we should really prioritize the long term.
Totally, I totally agree. And I don't think it necessarily always has to be, it is obviously there's something that's pleasant and helpful, right? We all want that. There's no disagreement with that. Then there's something that's not pleasant, but it's helpful. And then there's something that's unpleasant and unhelpful. Nobody wants that. But then there's something that's pleasant, but it's not helpful. And that's a lot of the world, right? Now, I love this dynamic you throw in short term versus long term. And I say, yeah, a lot of my experience aligns that. I wouldn't say all the time, though. I mean, just maybe in Dhamma, there can be something short term that's pleasant. And it also helps and beneficial. But it also can add up and accumulate and something that's helpful long term. I would say a daily sitting meditation, right? Not every day is a daily sitting meditation going to be pleasant and beneficial, but a lot of times it is. And it's towards that long term thing, but it's every day, day by day, right? It has a cumulative effect. So we don't want to write off something. As you know, it's not important. It's short term. I don't need to do it because it does have a cumulative effect. But yeah, totally in agreement that these long term things outweigh, because the classic thing in Buddhist is, would you let go of a shorter pleasure or a minor pleasure in order to have a long term, long game welfare and happiness? And yeah, people that are wise, they will forego the quick fixes usually for the long-term welfare and happiness, right? Yeah. So these are really good points here.
Yeah, and then another thing you touched was is it good for me versus is it good for the whole? That's I think that's another fascinating subject. Um, and my exploration really has been that in the end, again, looking long term, what's good for the whole is basically always going to be good for me, and what's good for the small me is the kind of thing, especially when it's at the expense of the whole, that's going to be the kind of short-term pleasure that I want to avoid. And I would say it's basically a function of wisdom. When you truly see how reality is formed, or how the patterns of cause and effect operate, and you know it well enough so that you can kind of anticipate what kind of effect you will get from a certain action, then you tend to not be selfish at all. Or I would say it like this: you see that the most selfish thing that you can do is to not be selfish at all. So it kind of like the dichotomy gets lost, because the most selfish thing you can do for yourself, for your own higher benefit, is to really maximize the benefit of the other.
It's a good way to put it. I heard someone say, if I want something for myself, I should want it for everyone. So what could you give me an example of the first thing you said? Did you say something like, if it's good for the whole, it's good for me? Now, you don't mean like, if 51%, if it benefits 51%, then I benefit from it and
No,
everybody
not like
else.
that.
I was gonna say, because that's the fallacy of democracy,
Right,
right? Because
right.
if you just have 51%, well, they're in charge, but the other 49%, they get the short end of the stick. You don't mean it like
No,
that.
no, not at
No.
all. I'm just talking about my inner processes. How do I make a decision? Because I think that's eventually what life is all about, what reality is all about, right? From the first person, reality is all about making decisions, and we make like hundreds or maybe thousands of decisions every day. And then how do we make them, right? That's, to me, that's the whole game. And so very often you have, let's say you have decision A and decision B. Decision A is what seems to be good for you, but is not, maybe, and I'm simplifying, but just to make a point, what seems to be good for you but not good for the rest. That's what I mean. The whole, I mean, coming from a model where there's me and then there's the rest, right? Like a kind of like a dualistic model, right? There's me and then there's the not me, right? So the not me I call the whole, the other, right? And
Yes.
so what I would say in my experience so far, what I've seen by observing the patterns and how the causes and the effects, uh, there seems to be a metaphysical rule that always operates, as far as I can see, that when I prioritize the interest of the whole, that's when I get a good result. And by the way, the whole, of course, it includes me. It doesn't mean that now I'm gonna, cut out my liver and give it to someone else. I'm not talking about that. It's not like I'm gonna sacrifice myself. It's more about what's good for everyone, which includes me, right? Rather than just what's good for me. And I think this is when you follow this path of exploration. What I've seen is that in the long term, it always ends up, the decision that's good for the whole, for the other, is actually also the best decision for myself long term.
It's a good way to put it. My fiance puts it, if what would the world look like if everybody was doing what I was doing? You know what I mean? Because it kind of puts some of our choices then in perspective. I would just say we're very fortunate to be have some extra access to decision making, because it seems like most of the world is just running, operating on habit patterns, right? And including myself a lot of times, just automatic pilot based on habit patterns. And that's where a lot of the decisions come from. But the more I think mindfulness awareness we get, we realize there's way more choices than just what we've been told, what we've been conditioned, what our habits are in making decisions too. I would say, add a caveat in here, that not everything is subject to karma, right? There's certain other niyamas, I think they call them, like the weather patterns, even though it does some things, I guess, tie in, but different laws of the mind. What are some of the other things? But yeah, we're talking about cause and effect with intentionality. And so intentionality is the huge thing behind cause and effect, right? Because if we're just doing something, yeah, the cause and effect might apply, but it's when we do something with intention, when we think, say something with intention, even if we think something with an intention, it is subject to cause and effect. Um, in a way that if something just happens without intention, in my experience, it doesn't seem to be as subject to cause and effect as yeah, then so basically one classic example of this is it makes sense is when I walk down the road, right? If I happen to step on an ant, but I don't, first off, I don't know that I did, and I don't have the intention to kill it, then it's not going to have the same effect and blowback and consequences if I go outside deliberately to seek out an ant with the intention of killing it because of whatever reason or lack of reason, So this is a key distinction I feel when it comes to this as well. Yes.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And look, in this example, and it's not just about stepping on an ant. I would call this carelessness, and not necessarily with the ant. But sometimes people are emotionally careless. It's like, I didn't know that would hurt you. Sure, that's much better than knowing that would hurt somebody, but it still is carelessness, and I would say there still will be some kind of karmic repercussion. I like
It's a
this
good
notion
point.
of it was a guy called Tom Campbell. If I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Sounds familiar,
He
yeah.
has this thing called the theory of everything, or he calls it my big toe, TOE. And one thing that he says, which I think is brilliant, is that the universe is or reality is a simulator that's optimized for your growth. And I'm totally on board with that. And I think it will really always give you exactly what's best for you, again, long term, right? So what does that mean, growth? I mean, that's another maybe path of exploration. But let's say if you're being careless, right? Well, I didn't know. Okay, what's the universe going to do? If it's maximized for your growth, it's going to make you know, right? And how can it do that? Well, you're going to be in that position of that other person that got hurt by your carelessness.
Now this is a really good point, because I don't know exactly the other points you talked to, but this is where the heart has to come in. Because not only carelessness, the Buddha recommended being heedful. Being heedful is the path to the deathless. Being heedless is as if you're dead already. So this is a really high priority that needs to be pay attention, be heedful. Also, if that happens, then then for me, I would say, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I want to do better now. Help me understand how that affected you so that I don't do it again, because I have this commitment to non-harming." And this is the core of all ethical things, I feel, is non-harming. So if we're really committed, then the heart will leap up and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't understand. Help show me a different way, because I don't want to harm you or anyone else. It's due to my ignorance and my lack of heedfulness. And so I want to make a resolve to not do that again, and kind of make a commitment to put forth more efforts to prevent that from arising and happening in the future, So yeah, these are things. Now, the whole simulation thing, this is kind of a popular theory going on. I will say that, of course, we live in a type of situation with our perception, right? What we perceive is just a really small slice of what's actually going on, right? We can only see in a certain bandwidth of a spectrum that's available, and this, like the visual field, it's color, light, and form, and we just label it whatever we label it for convenience, name and form, and that's. We live in a world of concepts. So in a way, living in this world of concepts that we do, because we can't really, most of us can't discern ultimate reality, in our daily, day-to-day lives, moment to moment. Although there are some practitioners today who I have faith that they can, due to really strict teachings and really intense practice, and I just say wisdom, and they're ripe for it too. I guess their parami are ripe to do it. However, that's so in a way, we do live in a simulation, meaning that the mind lives in a world of concepts. Now, I love the optimism that you're putting on it, that it's optimized for our growth. I would say yes, if we allow it to. I have seen people that are just really interested in oblivion, and that's it. And the more they choose oblivion and not caring and apathy and kind of self-destruction, things like that, I don't know if that's, for their most growth, but it's that opportunity is there, for it to be. But again, like you say, to choices, and choices are real. Yeah, they are so paramount, monumental. And, even that, like, some people would start throwing this free will thing, and I don't think choices are necessarily free will. You know what I mean? It's just, how do we make these decisions? What are they based on? I think if we really break down to the minutest point, what really drives every single decision, or lack thereof, or choosing not to decide too. So these are really vast, profound things that can be taken in really granular detail, and that are, I think, kind of hard to verify too, but we can definitely agree on the importance of our decisions, or at least the illusion that we have these decisions and choices in life. Either way, so where we'll just seem to make the decisions until we can get to the point where we can see through if it is an illusion or not, whether or not they are actual decisions made by however they're being made. And yeah, so many per day. But all right, Ivor, I'm going to let you finish this train, and we haven't really even got into, so maybe we'll have to come back on another time, because I wanted to talk about kind of your game theory things, randomness. We did talk a little bit about cause and effect, the mirroring effect. We barely touched on that, and we touched a little bit on truth, but I think there's still more to go there. So I'll throw
Yeah,
it
maybe
back to you here
we need
to
a
fit.
longer session, huh?
We might, yeah. Well, I throw it back to you to start addressing that, and then wrapping it up too. Leave you with, like, anyone that's listening to this. Then what would you like to leave with them? Like something that's important that you feel, either now or in the long run, timelessly, or whatever you'd like to say.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what my life is about, and I would say that's really what everyone's life is about, even though people may be aware of that to one degree or another. But it's really all about pattern recognition, right? Really figuring out, how does this thing work? right? And first of all, the fundamental question is, well, what is this thing in the first place? And we kind of touched on that a little bit. Yeah, I wish we could go deeper into it, but I think we you know we
Yeah, there's a possibility we could do another one. I mean, reality, that's what this is all about. Unfortunately, Buddhism's been labeled as a religion, but to me, it's just this map of this is what the Buddha found out about reality, and then the best way to go about it. To me, that's what I think most practitioners should be doing anyway. Yeah, what is this, and what's the best way to go about it?
exactly, yeah. And then I would just say trial and error, like see what works, see what doesn't work, try this, try that. That's certainly been my approach, and I'm happy with it. And sometimes you have a really bad beat, but it's worth it because that's how you get the wisdom, right? You really mess up, and you're not going to do that again, right? And so to me, that's the advantage of not being dogmatic and not being too constricted within any kind of set of rules. Although there's benefits to that for sure, but ultimately, the best rules are the ones that deep inside of you don't want to break, right? And you touched a little bit. We talked a little about carelessness and that, and I wanted to go into like a really good personal experience, personal example of that. Like I didn't mean
Sure,
to.
go ahead. Yeah.
Well,
No,
just
no,
just
go,
very
go.
briefly.
Sure, no,
In my
we've plenty of
earlier
time for that.
days, like I can now say I was quite careless, for example, in my relationships, in my romantic relationships. And at the time, I had no idea. I honestly never wanted to harm anybody. And I didn't even think about myself as being careless, right? It's just because I was just not sensitive enough to feel the pain of the other. And so now from the perspective of what we're talking about, I would say the universe, reality, had no other way of showing me that but to put me into a reverse position where I got to experience all of that pain and suffering, where it was literally reverse. And only after that, first of all, I realized what I had done. And then after that, that experience, for example, was so deep, or a series of those experiences, that there's just no way I can do that again, right? Not because I believe something, it's just I know it so deeply, organically, I'm not gonna go there again. And I think that's just an example, just for really how the universe works in many other ways, right? Basically in every way, I would say. You need to go through a certain kind of pattern until you really kind of master it, right? And usually that has to do with a lot of pain, in my experience.
It happens, and this is not a reward and punishment system. This is a cause and effect
Right.
system, right? And that, like the thing you said, you learn from the experience, and we don't want to go down that road again because we know from experience where that leads to, and we now have a choice. It doesn't really matter so much what's happened in the past. If we learn from it, that's what we need to do. That's it. But right now we have a choice. We have a chance to do something different, and our actions and our speech and our thoughts matter. So it's not to get drugged down by what's happened in the past. It's to learn from it and realize now is the chance we have to make a difference. So I just want to add that in there. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe the last thing I want to say, another concept that I think is crucial is just what I call radical responsibility. Like really, really, accepting complete and total responsibility for every aspect in one's life, which is not always easy to do, right? Because it comes so naturally, or maybe we're so conditioned to blame it either on something else, somebody else, or to call it kind of random, nothing to do with me. And I think that's never really true. And I mean, maybe that's an extreme statement, but I believe in it. Okay, sometimes it may not be completely obvious. In fact, usually it's not completely, totally obvious. But that would be an example of what I would call faith. Like in every situation, I have faith that one way or the other, I've created that situation with my actions, with my thoughts, with my beliefs, with my attitudes. Even though I may not quite see it, I do have faith based, but this faith is based on previous experiences and previous patterns. I have faith. Yeah, I'm creating this, right? So then the question becomes, how did I create this, right? And then to me, that kind of changes the whole dynamic of how I then approach this situation. And I would say if that's the only thing, if that's one thing that we can do more, we're going to live in a completely different reality, right? Accepting responsibility for our lives and for our situation.
And it's empowering too, right?
Yeah.
Because the more responsibility we take, the more empowerment that comes along with it. And I would just add, the way I'm approaching this now is it's not so important, at least right now, for me to know, where it came from, how it caused it, if it's me or someone else. The matter of the fact is it's happening. It's happening to me, or I'm in it. Whatever's going on in my experience, I now have to take responsibility for that. It doesn't really, it's beside the point whether I'm some kind of victim of circumstance or whether I perpetuated it, or I don't know where it's coming and I'm confused about it. Yes, ideally, the wisdom would be there to know immediately all that stuff, but a lot of times it's not. But the priority is, okay, here it is. I have to take responsibility for it. If I don't, there's probably going to be even more damage and recklessness come and fallout. So put on my big boy pants. This is happening. I have to take responsibility for it, because that's how this victimizer cycle ends too. Nobody wants to take responsibility. And that's how it ends, to do something different than perpetuating a cycle over and over. Say, okay, yes, it might be unpleasant, but now I take responsibility for this and do something different. And I don't really see where it needs to be, any blame needs to be leveled either to me or anyone else, It's just what's happening, and then either responsibility or lack of responsibility, and then wise action. Yeah. And then how am I holding this in my heart, and what am I going to do with it or not do with it? So yeah, that's a really important reminder. I can't really emphasize that enough. So thanks for that too.
Yeah, and I would say it's
Well,
not really about
yeah.
blame. It's more about seeing the actual cause, right? And asking yourself, okay, I don't
Yes.
like this situation. How can I make it better next time, right? Rather
Yes.
than abdicating responsibility. And by abdicating responsibility, you abdicate power.
Really good points. Yep. All right. Well, cool, Ivan. This has been a pleasure for me, a joy, and I really appreciate this feedback and spiritual friends in the past. So it's really good catching up with you again, and yeah, hopefully we can do this again down the
Yeah, it's
road.
been
So
great. Thank you very much, Josh.
yeah, my pleasure. All right. May all beings everywhere realize awakening and be free. Bye.